The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you the second half of our orchestration analysis lecture on Saturn from Holst's Planets. The first lecture was really long, and the thing about it was that there just was nowhere to break off the way that the music was naturally progressing, so that if I were to stop it halfway through the middle of the music, then I would have to recap a lot of the things that I was talking about, a lot of the concepts. So a much more natural break was at figure 5, and that's what I've decided to do. However, that will make this a bit of a shorter lecture, so that's all right. It really is like a second part to this piece. To continue on with the sort of cultural analysis or the contextual analysis of what Saturn means, up to this point, we sort of saw the cost of aging. There's a certain majesty, but also a certain kind of inertia, an insistence on having one's own way and being an authority and really wanting to control everything so it's as safe as possible for you, and telling them young fellers to get off my lawn. That kind of idea is really, I think, prevalent in the music that came up to this point. But I feel that this is the beautiful part of getting older now that Holst is going to express, and that is a certain kind of letting go, which is something I referred to in the previous lecture. And that is being able to look at things with an all-encompassing perspective. I'm really not of the school of getting to a certain age and then telling young people what to do. I feel like I'm more of the school of Eric Satie, who, when he got older, celebrated younger composers and younger artists with a will, and he was just so fascinated in what they had to say and what they were doing and how they were changing culture and moving forward. And he wanted to be a part of that. And he was constantly working with the younger generation on different projects and collaborations and everything towards the end of his creative career. And I feel that that is the way to go myself. When I get upset about certain things, like, say, politically or culturally or whatever, and this is not to get political at all, but just to explain a certain outlook about aging, which has to do with this piece. When I get upset about certain injustices that I see in society, I tend to think of them almost in a knee-jerk way as being crimes against the young, right? I actually had a fairly complicated and difficult childhood and young adulthood myself, and lots of people were putting things in my way and being jerks, and the way society was structured was way more difficult for the things I wanted to do back when I was that age than it is now. It's a lot easier to get the kinds of things done that I wanted to get done back then nowadays, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of information and the feeling of belonging and feeling that there are other people out there that can come together and share perspectives and get stronger, and that's what Orchestration Online is all about, in fact. So that is what I'm doing as I age. That's what I feel when I listen to this, or when I consider what the context is here, if there even is one at all, if there's a programmatic or cultural context to what Holst is trying to express here. And of course, in his own way, as an instructor at St. Paul's, he saw many young musicians who were getting into music and hopefully would be able to graduate at a much, much higher level. And he was providing that as their teacher and mentor and everything else. And he had a really great staff, too, who helped him with his creative projects. Like, for instance, the instructors who played the piano scores many, many times for him to listen to of the planets, so that he could think about it and make sure that he was making the right decision in his imagination. So anyhow, that is what I feel with this second half of Saturn. It's the positive part of getting older, not just some fear that you're going to die or that the seasons aren't long enough or that you're worried that the color is leaching out of your life or that you're not getting the same kind of satisfaction as younger people out of things, and all those other fears are sort of set aside because now we're just going to let go, right, with the music. Speaking of letting go, we just came off of a page where the music relaxed a little bit so that it could allow this much, much more discreet, much softer orchestration after that massive tutti of 2 or 3 pages ago. So we're going down to 2 desks per group in the string section, muted, and they had plenty of time to get those mutes on in the previous page. Holst is usually very, very good about giving the players time. However, he does mark that the double basses are not using any mutes. Now, you might think of this as a little bit of overkill because bassists rarely use mutes at all and rarely even need them because, A, they're generally speaking a softer instrument, being viol family members rather than violin family members. And, of course, a good bass player can play as if they've got a mute on, right? Just by adjusting where the bow is and adjusting how they bow. But it is good to use mutes on a bass from time to time for certain effects. But Holst is just really making sure that the conductor doesn't get to this page or this figure and say, I think that the double basses also need some mutes there because everybody else is. But, of course, Holst doesn't want that because he's about to have the bass group play soli, right? So, once again, kind of reiterating some of the material that happened before. Now, over this, very, very soft accompaniment, and notice like how small it is, really. It's essentially a dovetailing of this harmony here in the bassoons, right? We've got a B, an E, and a G sharp. And here they are. Here's our B, here's our E, and there is our G sharp. So that is dovetailing over. Plus you've got this E fifth on top here. All right, and then the inner part of the harmony is going to continue on. Just a simple E third, changing here to an E sixth with C sharp on top, and so on and so forth. But this low note here basically just gets out of the way so that the double basses do not have any competition at all as they play along, especially from violas. The sound of a double bass can disappear into the violas even with this kind of restraint from the other strings. So it's very, very wise orchestration. This F sharp is actually, of course, an octave lower, right? So it would be right down here, down a fifth from the violas, about as high as the double basses would get, but he just really needs them to get out of the way. And that's why the strings are just so gently accompanying this double bass group solo. And on top of that, we have these wonderful alternating harmonics in the harps. One per hand, right? And played at the pitch intended rather than at the sound intended. And it's just a lovely chiming here, especially after the bells that we heard before. So it carries over that idea in the listener's mind of those bells. So if it's played sensitively enough, and of course with the harpist playing really more like about mezzo piano or mezzo forte to be heard in this texture, then it's magic like nothing else. Let's have a listen to that, since it's quite long, before we go on to the next screen, and then I will see you there for more beautiful ideas. moving on here, let's talk about the support before we talk about the melody. And that is that here the middle strings are dovetailing right into the horns. Once again, if you've got great horn players who are really listening to what their role is in the music, they'll come in right here and it'll feel seamless. That is something that horns can do like no other instrument if they're really good. And that goes on for a while, turning here into a simple D fifth, right? And then a D diminished fourth. It's such simple support. I really love that. And then around it, we've got this filigree here. This is an example of a harp being used in a beautiful way. It's a bit pianistic the way that it's written. I think that I personally would have divided this across two harps so that the second harp was playing the lower line and the first harp was playing the upper line. I just feel that that would be a little bit more opportune in terms of just the technical demands. I mean, not that this is technically demanding at all, but it's just a little bit fiddly of the harpist's fingers kind of going back and forth. So if they need more control, like say if the conductor is going a little too fast, or if the conductor is really eager for them to balance with the flutes, then they're able to manage it without too much fuss. So that's just kind of me being a little fussy there, but I do think that that would be a better outcome. But that is doubling with the flutes and alto flute, not bass flute. And this is the third flute and alto flute part, taking the bottom intervals here in the harp part. And first and second taking the upper intervals. So just a beautiful doubling, kind of the chiming idea of alternating back and forth. And we've got ourselves a low wind statement here. A3 clarinets. And here, of course, in the absence of bass flute, first clarinet will play the small notes. And this would work pretty nicely if that were the situation. But otherwise, A3 clarinets, bass clarinet in octaves, A3 bassoons, and contrabassoon. So this forms a triple octave with the clarinets on top. If this is played softly enough and sensitively enough, that kind of hollow sound is minimized with the clarinets. So you don't really hear that opening of the Sixth Symphony of Tchaikovsky sort of effect as much here, especially with all of the other octave doubling. But that's so long as things stay sensitive. There was a little caution earlier on that the double basses were not to crescendo when they played their statement, and that same approach is going to be taken here. Once that has been laid down by previous instruments, the conductor will stick to that particular lack of dynamic arc, because it's all built right into the pitches. It's an emotional arc that has to do more with the interactions of the instruments rather than inflating the amount of force that they've got. Here we see a little bit of melodic development, which I think is very, very cool. The fourth and sixth horns come in, and then I love this part right here, where the third and fifth hold on to the top note, and then the lower horns play the octave as the other instruments jump down the octave. That's so neat. Really a cool idea. Let's listen to all that before we move on to the next thing. So listen for all of those elements, the harp kind of bubbling along softly in the background with the flutes and alto flute, then the melodic statement by the lower winds joined by low horns right towards the end. And speaking of horn, that lovely little harmonic background that's going on here. It's kind of like a mini pad. And I will see you on the next screen. The first thing that I'm going to mention here on this passage starting from figure 6 is the way that ottava is scored here. I really feel that this is a distraction. By my way of thinking, this should have been ottava with both hands or an ottava line over both staves. Because essentially, the part that is being written here is just starting a couple of beats earlier than this part, and it's the same part, right? So it's just easier to read this like this, with both hands being in positions where you can see the relationship, rather than one hand being actually scored above the other, right? With the right hand with an ottava mark over it. Now, granted that this is just 4 quarter notes worth of pattern repeated over and over and over again in different places along the framework of a 3/2 bar. And it's alternating with the first harp at an octave higher. So it's not too hard for the harpist to sort of figure it out and then just continue that pattern over and over again. But my feeling is that if you see this scoring, it could lead to bad habits. So not taking it into account that this is a very small pattern that's being repeated, somebody reading this might think, oh, well, I'll just write a fairly complex thing for harp, and since the right hand is so high, I'll just put an ottava mark over that. Now, it's better to have both parts ottava, or to indicate that the line applies to both parts. Okay, all that aside, this is essentially an accompaniment to this wonderful little pattern here. Now, do you recognize this? Think back to a piece that we may have analyzed recently and see if you remember a figure like this, diving down and then jumping back up in 16th notes on the very last beat, or half a beat in this case, since we're in 3/2. If you haven't recognized it by now, it is from Jupiter. Do you remember the part where there is a tambourine doing a bit of a trill, a thumb trill, along with diving winds and the brass playing in a sort of a syncopated way? Well, that is pretty much what's going on here, only, of course, done much slower and with different harmony. But it's the same essential gesture. I feel that in this case, it's probable that this came first in the sketches for Saturn, since Saturn was the first piece to be sketched or to have sketches composed of it. So this may have been shared with Jupiter, and Holst might have felt that the resonance would be very interesting to explore, if anybody noticed it, right? Because this accompaniment is so soft that it's easy to really get lost in the vastness of this very gentle texture. I love the way that the horns are basically playing what the flutes are going to play at the end of the movement, overlapping with another pattern in a similar way that the upper flutes and the lower flutes work. Not really the same, but similar. In this case, it's the same exact pattern that is just dovetailing one to the next and climbing one on top of the other. We've already talked about how these two patterns go back and forth or overlap each other all the way through the passage. Interesting that there was no way of really having any kind of wind accompaniment to the alternating harp, right? There's just the flutes, but it's complex enough. When you consider all the overtones coming from these very softly played horns, then that is probably enough. On top of this, we've got the tubular bell coming back and alternating back and forth between A and G. In this case, creating a 5 quarter notes against 3 half notes of the meter. 3 beats on the first strike and 2 on the second, going back and forth all the way through this accompaniment. Now that pretty much continues for the next 3 pages with really pretty much no difference at all to the accompaniment pattern. So we can just spend the rest of the time talking about how the melody is scored, starting off with contrabassoons doubling the double basses, cellos an octave higher than that, and violas an octave higher, and so on, and then the violins on top. But notice how those violins actually play the lowest note possible that they can, as much as they can. So instead of jumping up to A, like everything else does, up a fourth, the violins dive down a fifth and keep it very, very low. And it's very beautiful, this sort of Sol G playing at pianissimo. Just a wonderful, rich, soft sound. If that weren't enough, we've got this octave organ pedal here, 16-foot and 32-foot stops, which are going to create an octave that is essentially the same as the lower strings. This rises a little bit. We're going all the way up a seventh with our melodic motion, and then to an octave on the final E. By the time we get to this G here, there's a lovely little overlap here where the trombones come in, starting off on a unison with this E, but then changing to an octave here at this is an A, right, below middle C, changing to an octave here as the strings let go. And it can be done so smoothly that you will barely notice the change in timbre, right? That really entails the trombones coming in soft and filling into their sound rather than just hitting this A too brutally. Combined with the ongoing sound of the bassoons, bass clarinet, and clarinets, it just really makes a lovely, soft, yet solid sound going on. Then when we get to here, we're adding more and more elements. The strings coming back, very soft trumpets, and of course the oboe family. Essentially kind of doubling here. We've got the oboes and first and second trumpet both playing C thirds. And then this E right here is being doubled by the third trumpet E. This G in here is pretty much just kind of like filler, right? Which is being echoed in other places. We've got the bass trombone just holding down the G here, and tenor trombone playing this G, and so on. Bassoons playing a G along with the bass clarinet. So it's just kind of holding down the fifth of that C major chord. Meanwhile, the harmony of the oboes gives way into melodic contribution, as do the third and fourth trumpet. And here is where it's risky, I feel, that the trumpets, if they really aren't thinking about playing very soft and blending into the texture, that they might stick out a little bit. And this does happen from time to time, as you'll hear with like youth orchestras and regional orchestras and so on, where there might not be the same level of integration and expertise and experience with very soft textures. Going on, we have this lovely moment here. F major chord being held in the trumpets and bassoons and second and third clarinet. A couple notes here and there with the other instruments. But the melody really being taken over by the strings, this simple upward reaching motive as the bass starts to walk down. I love this E going to D, going to C, which we also see in the bass clarinets and bass oboe. And this is sort of giving us a little hint of how this music is going to resolve. Here we've got something similar, but this time the lower strings are contributing more harmonically, along with the trombones, and of course the bass tuba adding on to that slow walk down with the lower strings and lower winds, and just a simple single oboe adding on to now just octaves in the violins without the entire string section really joining together. Let's listen to all of those things. Pay close attention to how the accompaniment is scored and this wonderful fluttering down and then swooping back up of the flutes. And then also watch how the melody moves throughout the orchestra, from the string section on their lowest strings through to the trombones and lower winds, and then coming back to this lovely sort of middle winds and strings idea. All the time, just playing against the lovely fluttering and surging background accompaniment. And then I will see you for the very last page of this lecture on Saturn, the bringer of old age. So finally we arrive at the very last page. The ultimate letting go, I think, which is part of Saturn's character, culturally and astrologically and historically symbolically. Now, I just want to say once again, I am not an astrologer. I have no experience or interest really in that. I just really am passionate about orchestration. But I'm also interested in musical history and knowing what things meant to the composers who created them. And in this case, I think those are parts of the meanings that we can actually see in the way that the orchestration works. And that is also important too. Context is a really important thing to know. So here I see Holst just letting go. A beautiful life, really well lived. That doesn't mean that that is the end, a beautiful death or anything. It just means the essence of completion, right? Finality, which doesn't have to be morbid. It doesn't have to be anything like that. It's just knowing when to quit, maybe. That's also part of this. What I feel we've got here on this last page, which I could have made part of the lecture of the last section, but I've decided to have on its own, is just a really perfect soft texture. Just perfectly scored. We've got clarinets here playing a G octave with an E in the middle. I'm talking concert pitches. And bass clarinet here on a low concert C, which is essentially the same note as these violas down here. So that is like a pad going on with the bass clarinet joining in on the upwards motion of the low strings. As to the low strings, C octave, C fifth, which is very easy to play because it's just open strings. The viola's divisi into open C string with the fingered E on the G string. And then here we've got open G with a G fingered on the D string. And those are very, very simple to play. Once again, telescoping with the upward motion of the lower strings, ending up on this G right here. All the way through that, we've got E fifths, not C fifths, in the violins. And that creates the sort of super sweet feeling of a major seventh chord. Now, while all that is going on, we've got the little motive that ran through the accompaniment of the horns in the previous passage, bum, 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 with the upper flutes, and then the third flute and alto flute echoing it an octave lower. Now, both of those little motives of accompaniment are being doubled by the harps, but in a really, really cool way. What's happening is that Holst is dividing these two different phrases between the two different hands in two different ways. So for the upper phrase, remembering that these are played at pitch and sounding an octave higher, correct? Bum, 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 right? Bum, 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 and then answering below, bum, 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 bum. The same exact pitches. Doing it this way ensures that there won't be any stomping. That's the whole point to this, right? Because all of these pitches are unique within one single iteration of the motive. However, if you were to actually play this, you would be repeating the C and the B, right? So this B would be played here and there if this were played by one harp. So if you're going to go one harp playing dun, 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 and then of course the C would be repeated as well. So Holst is already thinking about that and divides it between the players like this. And that makes a huge difference. It just helps it to be very, very subtle and no stomping. Right towards the end, as these lower strings have risen up here to a G octave and then letting go of this G, right as that happens, the horns come in, triple P, and once again, if you've got one of the best orchestras in the world, it will feel seamless. The horns will just appear to come in, and you won't even notice them. They will just float there. Now, that's not possible for every orchestra, as you will hear in different interpretations by orchestras of greater and lesser experience. But I still love the way that Holst hides any possible roughness of transition with one last bell stroke. So by hitting that, so long as the bell comes in right on time with the horns, then that will cover any possible problem that there would be in the dovetailing here of these horns coming in. Keeping in mind that they're simply playing a C major chord with a G in the bottom, right? And what's going on here? We've got a C major chord with a G in the bottom with the clarinets. So if played softly and sensitively enough, and everybody's really listening to the very discrete sounds that are happening around them, it should be seamless, but it isn't always. And this just continues on, and the very, very soft accompaniment gets absorbed into the very tail end of the upper harmony, and that is the end of Saturn. It was really lovely bringing this lecture to you, even though I am taking just a couple days out to put these lectures together for you on Patreon, which of course will appear later on when they're released on YouTube. It's really great to be getting back to the planets, and I will not really have a chance to return to this until my entire course on the wind section is completed. But I'm really looking forward to bringing you Uranus, the Magician, which will be coming up for Patreon in about exactly a month. So as my winds course goes into its final editing stage and it's completely in the can, then I will return to these lectures, bring you Uranus, and then Neptune the Mystic. And the whole course for Patreon should be finished by the end of 2018, and will continue on into 2019 for regular release on YouTube. Anyhow, thank you so much for your support and for joining me for these lectures, and I can't wait to show you even more previews of the 103 Wind Instruments course as they become available. Thanks much, everybody, and I will see you soon.